Today's episode is sponsored by JetStore. JetStore meets your evolving needs for data storage, protection, and management. JetStore also leverages leading technologies to offer high value solutions for NAS, SANs, clouds, and hyperconverged infrastructures. Visit JetStore at jetstore.com. That's JETSTOR.com to get started today. Welcome back to another episode of Data Protection Gumbo. And obviously, you know me, I am your host, Demetrius Malbro. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with Vivek Ramachandran, who is the founder of SquareX. And what is SquareX? SquareX is building a browser native security product to mitigate last mile attacks. SquareX has also raised about 6 million in seed funding from Sequoia Capital as well in 2023. So I have the pleasure of welcoming Vivek, founder of SquareX. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on the show. Super excited to speak with you.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you are really excited as well about the capital that you have coming in, the seed funding, and give us a maybe a short intro on SquareX and what, in your own words, you guys are solving.
Yeah. So, the whole idea behind SquareX really started pretty much in the last company that I did and sold, Pen Tester Academy, where I was interacting with a lot of red teams. And at that time, what most of these teams would come back and say, hey, Vivek, is there a way to bypass, web browsers and go ahead and drop malicious files and all of that, onto a user system, which attackers might end up exploiting?
Hmm.
So that got me thinking. I went in and looked web proxies, which were the fundamental way to go ahead and, filter bad traffic. And then I quickly realized that they weren't good enough. And once I kind of figured that, went in, started researching. And that's when the whole idea about could we have something sitting in the browser, watching what is happening and taking action right there where, everything is happening. So
Mm.
that is how the idea for SquareX came about to be. And, one thing led to the other. And we started the company, we got in investors, and we just launched our enterprise product literally at RSA
Okay.
in May.
Nice. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
And so we're talking browser security, but how do you define browser security? And also, why is it important for enterprises today? We know that there's a lot of things out there. You have all different types of like ransomware attacks and fake deep fakes. There's so much out there right now. So what's your definition of browser security and why is that important?
Correct. No, that's a great question. So today, if you look at browsers like Chrome, Edge, Safari, the browser vendors, primarily when it comes to security, are only concerned about primarily software vulnerabilities.
Hmm.
So if there is a 0 day in Chrome where somebody figured out a buffer overflow or a Chrome sandbox evasion, so that is their primary occupation. But if you think about it, once websites end up loading, there are application level vulnerabilities which come into play. So, a very simple example where you are on social media, you ended up clicking on a link, and all of a sudden you see a page similar to Twitter where it looks like you have to log back in.
Hmm.
Now, for a browser vendor, this isn't something they really care about because in their mind, they worry about the more low-lying underlying issues. So similar to that, there are hundreds of other cases: identity attacks, session hijacking. All of us now, download and install random browser extensions which
Yeah.
promise free access to Chat GPT Premium.
Hmm. Hmm.
So all of these little things kind of add up, and this is the threatscape when it comes to browser security. So when I say browser security, what we mean is, users, your employees are on the browser going about work, and there are all of these web workflows which are happening while your
Hmm.
employees work on various websites. And browser security is about monitoring, inspecting, and then blocking and isolating certain actions which in your organization you view as bad and something you'd ideally want to put a stop to.
So, like, we don't have to worry about ransomware when it comes to browser
So, so
security.
that's a great question.
Okay.
So, Demetrius, if you think about it, almost every single attack which happens on an employee's endpoint, the gateway is the browser. So
Okay.
you end up, clicking on a bunch of links or downloading a malicious Office document, which in turn, downloads and executes a ransomware. So
Ah.
I think the browser is the so simple example. Let's say, there's a large company and
Mhm.
an attacker is sending DMs on LinkedIn to your sales team telling you, hey, I love your product. I'd love to buy it. Go ahead, please fill up this form and download our requirements.
Okay.
Now, every salesperson on the planet, I mean, that is the perfect, kind of inbound lead, right? He's going to click
Yeah.
on it, fill a form, download an Office document, and that is probably malicious. Your endpoint security triggers and says this is ransomware.
Mhm.
But the tricky part is when your IT security team goes to investigate, all you're going to get is Tom, Dick, and Harry downloaded ransomware via the Chrome browser.
Okay.
So there
Mm.
is zero attack attribution. You really don't know how that ransomware was downloaded, none of that part. So when the security team goes back to the employee, they either don't remember or don't want to tell.
Okay.
Now, that is the whole attack origin story. The whole source attribution of what happened is what, browser security company like SquareX is solving. So we can tell you that, look, your employee went on LinkedIn, John, which seems like a fake persona,
Mhm.
dropped a LinkedIn DM. Here were the bunch of intermediate websites where those clicks happened.
Mhm.
And then finally, this malicious ransomware ended up dropping. So we fill up that entire void, which at this point is just guesswork or hoping that your employees remember.
Thank you for clearing that up. And I also want to talk a little bit about generative AI because we can't get enough of AI right now with the rise of Nvidia and all of these other companies that seem to be skyrocketing just because of the technology that OpenAI just kind of blew the top off of Pandora's box. But
Correct.
what are some of the latest trends in cyber attacks that you're seeing, and also how can enterprises protect themselves, especially just from that browser protection perspective?
Yeah. And there are really two perspectives.
Hmm.
One is, of course, the speed at which developers are using generative AI to write code.
Okay.
Attackers are already also generating malicious code now at the same pace, which means, previously an attacker would have to wait for someone else to write a tool to exploit. But now he could go into many of these tools, try to very quickly create proof of concept attack tools.
Hmm.
So that is starting to make the time between a new attack getting discovered and attack tools being readily available to attackers very short. Now, the second part from an attacker's perspective is, now your, I would say, phishing email isn't grammatically incorrect.
Right.
Now it is very contextual. An attacker could train an LLM to go look at your social media, look at your connections and send out a crafted email very contextual to something you just posted on LinkedIn.
Hmm.
Basically saying, hey, Demetrius, you posted about this, interesting thing in disaster recovery. By the way, I've written this white paper I think you'd find interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
So, along with this compounding with deep fakes, where almost all of us have some audio clip of us circulating in social media,
Right.
when people can clone your voice, clone probably a quick video of how you look. So, we've relied a lot on our senses and our intellect to decide what is a fake, right? And that is how it's been.
Hmm.
Is you see a video and you know that, hey, this isn't even a real person. But now that isn't so. Now somebody could clone Vivek to make him look and sound like me entirely. And that is something I think is compounding. So attackers are now in a great situation where they're able
Yeah.
to do all of this effectively. Additionally, I think with generative AI, what's been happening is, and I remember the time when TVs had come out with microphones and cameras,
Right. Yeah.
and most people said, I'm never going to buy one with a camera in it.
Yeah.
Now, fast forward 2 years, the only TVs out there are the ones with cameras and microphones.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
I think generative AI is having the same effect in enterprises where a lot of them are blanket blocking Chat GPT and other websites and saying, look, we aren't ready. What happens if users end up copy pasting enterprise data, uploading files? So I think the other thing which has been happening is enterprises are starting to look for tools where they can, in a way apply their DLP policies, these websites, both inbound as well as outbound data.
Okay. And how difficult is it to do that? Because if you could actually stop an attack just by having the proper controls on the browser, then you probably would thwart a few of the attacks that individuals normally get. And especially you mentioned being able to copy and paste information or corporate information from inside the company into like a chat GPT. Is that something
Correct.
that can be stopped?
Correct. So that's a great question.
Hmm.
And if you think about it, where all of this is happening when it kind of comes to any form of user interactivity with websites is again in the browser. So the
Okay.
best place to build a security product, a DLP product, is actually once again in the browser itself.
Oh.
And that is really where I think, companies like ours, what we've tried to do is provide enterprises ways to write out policies where you could just go in and say, hey, you know what, allow clipboard copy pastes only within this enterprise whitelisted ecosystem of websites.
Hmm.
And when it comes to chat GPT, well, allow people to interact but not copy paste data which might contain, let's say, P2 information, or which might contain certain phrases or some documents which look similar to your enterprise documents.
Okay.
I think that's the only way that you can at this point in time resolve this problem.
Okay. That's very helpful. And one thing that I was also thinking about is just overall from a disaster recovery and data resilience aspect of it. So let's talk a little bit about security risks. And so we already touched on ransomware a little bit, but
Right.
do you think that it's going to basically some of the new security risks that are out there right now, especially ones pertaining to the browser, that they might fundamentally change how customers really should be thinking about just the overall resiliency aspect of keeping their business safe and keeping their operations running with things like ransomware, since that seems to be the hottest ticket that's
Absolutely.
out there, right?
Absolutely. And Demetrius, you bring up a very good point. If you think about it, around 10 years back, most work was still happening, on your desktop, right? We used to use Photoshop, Office Suite, all of that. And that's really where people were, or organizations were increasingly worried about things getting downloaded onto your computer,
Hmm.
and which, ending up becoming ransomware. But what's been happening is we are living in an increasingly cloud first world, right? Organizations are starting to get comfortable in using documents in Office 365, Google Workspaces, and all of that completely online. So,
Hmm.
what I envision is in the next few years, the need to download things on your computer and work on them is going to get, lesser and lesser important. And as that starts happening, your typical ransomware credential stealer is probably not going to infect your endpoint. Instead, it's going to infect your browser.
Mm.
Because if you think about it, all credentials to every single website, actually, most people end up saving in their browser anyway, or you use LastPass and OnePass, which any which ways, when you're finally logging into a website,
Hmm.
has to copy the password into that form.
Yeah,
So
right.
yeah, so imagine a credential stealer, which is a browser extension, rather than a ransomware which has to install on your computer.
Mm.
And
Okay.
that browser extension is being helpful 90% of the times. But click of a switch, it automatically goes ahead, steals your session data, steals your credentials, and really that's keys to the kingdom. So when it comes to, I feel, disaster recovery, data recovery, and all of that, most of today's tools are still built to monitor the endpoint, backup things that people are copying on their regular endpoint devices. But
Mm.
if you think about browser data and session data, these are things many of these tools currently don't have any visibility into. So most of the time, the fact that your credentials were stolen only comes into picture when those credentials were used to maybe log into your cloud environment, and download something, right? That's the time when you're like, hey, what just happened?
Yeah, right.
Why is John logging in from a country in Eastern Europe middle of the night?
Right, right,
So
right. Okay. Absolutely. And I also wanted to ask you, are there any like compliance or things that are browser related that companies really should be aware of from a regulation perspective? I'm not quite sure, but maybe you can enlighten the gumbo
yeah.
listeners around. Maybe you want to look out for this regulation or this thing that you need to be compliant with.
Yeah, so no, that's a great question as well. So interestingly, because browser security itself is such an early disruptive
Mm,
space, regulation and compliance really hasn't caught up where people are writing
okay.
out things specifically for browsers. Apart from, hey, keep your browsers patched, make sure that you're going about looking out for advisories and all of that.
Mhm,
But you bring up an interesting point. I feel like there is a lot of trickle down policies which ideally should apply to the browser environment as well. So, simple example, anything compliance regarding how you look at your credentials and your secrets should automatically apply, in the same right to browsers,
mhm.
because finally you're taking those secrets, most people saving them within browsers or using them via browsers. But I've found very few companies trying to do that. The second is identity attacks. So let's say when it comes to policies around your single sign on,
Mhm.
a
Okay.
lot of companies try to be compliant and say, hey, our SSO should only work on, these certain websites. But what we are increasingly seeing is, employees, when they go to third party websites and they see sign in with Google and sign in with,
Yeah.
Office 365,
Right.
no one's bothered, right? You click on it, shows up with an
You're
option with
right.
your company identity, and you're like, okay, let's just click, saves me a bunch of time.
Yeah.
So I think organizations need to think through applying policies where, in the browser, when a user ends up trying to access one of these third party websites which wasn't whitelisted,
Mhm.
hey, automatically the user needs to be educated and blocked from, going ahead with that interaction.
Mm.
So these are a couple of important ones. I feel at this point, to your question, things will trickle down into the browser, but not very browser specific.
Mm. Okay. And I was just having a conversation yesterday, and I think TLS 1.2 was mentioned, transport layer security. And I know that's something that's similar or related to protecting browser information or data over the browser. Is that something that is similar or something that is important to talk about here as well? Just dealing with
Mm,
overall
yeah,
S and browser
correct, correct,
security.
correct. That's a great question as well. I feel like, I mean, to your point, everything should be in a TLS world.
Hmm.
Everything, when it comes to accessing over a network, should be on an encrypted channel.
Okay.
And unfortunately, this isn't being forcibly applied onto browsers.
Mm.
And I'll give you a very simple example. Almost 99% of enterprises will still allow you to open up an HTTP website. And the tricky part really is that, look, most users have no way of knowing certain action makes them more vulnerable. And this compounds when you're actually on your mobile device, because
Mm.
mobile devices have such small real estate anyway, that
Mhm.
most of the times when you click to open a new link, you'll see that the browser address bar just ends up vanishing.
Right.
And, which means now visually, it's even more difficult for your enterprise employee to actually figure out, is this website, a phishing website, or even worse, something the attacker served via an MITM attack on a
Mhm.
hotspot that he controls, right? All of us are so eager to connect to free Wi-Fi wherever we go. So to your point, I think it has not been forced in a black and white way across enterprises, and there is a need to do that, because this is what I call in my world a downgrade attack, right? If
Mhm.
an attacker could somehow force you and downgrade your connection to an HTTP website, hey, you know what? He can monitor every single thing.
Mm. Wow, that is scary. And if there was one final thing that you could provide as advice for Gumbo listeners, just from a browser security perspective, what would that one thing be, Vivek?
So I would actually say that, now pretty much all of us are spending 90% of our time working on browsers, and that has become the gateway to applications, to transactions, and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really where taking browser security in a serious way is very important, both at an individual as well as an enterprise level. So just like, most of your listeners would be very cognizant of what they are downloading and installing on their computer, I would say, be just as vigilant when it comes to installing arbitrary browser extensions that you just heard of on social media, because today that has become the number one way by which attackers are infiltrating into your devices and
Okay.
stealing data. So if there is any takeaway, be vigilant about browser extensions
Mm-hmm.
that you're installing, and do not get swayed by somebody offering a premium service for free if you install their browser extension. I mean, there are 100 other attacks that I would love to talk about, but takeaways are just that one small thing, and this is what I would probably leave for your listeners.
Okay. So does that mean no browser extensions, or just be careful of which browser extensions you actually
Yeah,
utilize?
that's yeah. The tricky part is, unfortunately, for most people, it is very difficult to do that analysis
Mm,
themselves.
okay.
So my suggestion would be, just like before you buy anything, you go online, try to read reviews on third-party websites, on the Chrome store. Make sure before you install, you check out who the publisher is. If that is a credible company, if there are enough users that you could read through the reviews on the Chrome store and see if there are some reviews pointing towards fraud or pointing towards something suspicious,
Mm-hmm.
and try to limit the permissions you're giving to browser extensions, which is, when an extension opens, don't end up giving read, write, camera, all possible options just because an extension asks. Try to use your intelligence test to see, hey, this browser extension is saying it's going to allow me to copy something out of LinkedIn. Like, why does it really require this advanced permission? Which is, I mean, as an example, my camera or my microphone. So
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like an opportunity for AI, right? Like if you click on an
yeah,
extension, and before it actually installs or prompts you, AI goes behind the scenes and does a check and runs all the
yes,
proper scans and says, okay, you know what, something is malicious here, reads through the reviews and say, you might not want to move forward with this particular extension because it might be some issue or it might be malicious. Yeah.
absolutely. And you brought up a good point, right? I think what things are going to evolve to is all of us are going to have our personal AI security assistant, which is
Yeah.
constantly monitoring, interacting, warning, blocking, and working with us as we go about our daily work on the internet.
Yeah, and when you said that, it just brought to my mind more data storage, right? We're
Yes.
going to accumulate more data. There's just going to be so many more data centers popping up, so much more energy, and we're reading all of that today. And I think what we're
Yeah.
seeing across the world right now is just an explosion as far as trying to keep up with Gen AI and NVIDIA and all these chips. And I mean, it's a
Yeah.
new frontier right now.
Absolutely. And when I hear news articles which say it's going to cost $100 billion to train some of these models, and of course that is really just data center, CPU, and energy, right?
Right.
Uh, I mean, mind-boggling, but also, I mean, concerning a little bit that we are going to go ahead and use up that much of energy, and what effect that's actually going to have on so many other topics, right? Like
Yeah.
climate change
Okay.
and whatnot.
Absolutely. So, how can the Gumbo listeners go and maybe take a look at SquareX?
So what we've done is we've put out a free extension which people can use individually, where
Okay.
you can open up suspicious websites and files and all of that. So your listeners could go to sqrx.com, and there is a personal version which you can go install. It is absolutely free to try. And if you are part of an enterprise and you ever wondered, hey, how do I attack or approach browser security from my
Mhm.
enterprise's perspective, so we can sign you up for an absolutely no strings attached free pilot,
Okay.
where we could show you how we could improve your security posture when it comes to your users being on the browser, and how we could safeguard them. And yeah, I mean, as an individual or as an enterprise, you're free to explore and be in touch with us. You can email me directly at Vivek, Vivek at sqrx.com, and
Okay.
just mention that, hey, you heard about us on, the Data Protection Gumbo podcast, and I personally make sure that, I take care of you.
All right. Well, everyone, you've heard from Vivek around SquareX and how you can access the browser, which will help provide more security and also provide some resilience. So you just want to make sure that you're really vigilant about what you're clicking on, and just be really smart before you hit that button and start giving permissions, right, to just do any and everything with your infrastructure. So thank you again, Vivek. And before I let everyone go, be sure to check out the Backup and Recovery Professionals LinkedIn group that we have. There's about 26,000 professionals, and we're having conversations similar to the ones we are now. Backup and recovery, storage, blockchain, lots of different types of conversations, cryptocurrency, compliance, regulations, DORA, right? That's the Digital Operational Resilience Act. All different types of maybe nerdy conversations, but it's something that I'm passionate about, and all the Gumbo listeners are passionate about it as well. So Vivek, once again, thank you for being a guest right here on Data Protection Gumbo.
Thank you so much, Demetrius. I think it was an amazing conversation, and yeah, good luck with your show, and would love to be back on it, sometime soon. Thank you so much.